On the night of February 11th, 1945, thousands of German and Hungarian troops tried to break out of encircled Budapest through darkness, snow, and Soviet fire. Among them were men from one of the most feared formations in Hitler's war machine, the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. By then, Budapest was finished. The city had been under siege for weeks. Food was collapsing. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Buildings had become graves. The roads west were either blocked or under Soviet guns. But for the men of Totenkopf, the worst part was not simply that the ring had closed. It was that the army closing that ring had spent years learning exactly what the skull on their collar meant. That is the real engine of this story, because Totenkopf was not just another German division caught in Hitler's final disasters. It was a formation whose very name carried a political and moral weight that ordinary Wehrmacht units did not. By early 1945, the Soviets were no longer looking at that insignia as a battlefield symbol alone. They connected it to years of occupation, SS terror, camp power, anti-partisan warfare, and the wider Nazi system that had turned the Eastern War into something far more brutal than a conventional military campaign. So, when Budapest became a death trap, Totenkopf was not simply trapped by Soviet numbers. It was trapped by memory. That is what makes this story stronger than the usual elite division destroyed in the final months narrative. The skull had once been worn as a sign of prestige, hardness, and ideological loyalty. But by the end of the war, it had become something else entirely, a mark the enemy recognized, a symbol many civilians feared, and, in some sectors of the Eastern Front, a badge that could erase the fragile protections usually attached to surrender. That reversal did not happen overnight. It had been building since the division's beginning. Totenkopf was formed out of the SS Totenkopf Verbände, the Death's Head units associated with the concentration camp system, and its early identity was inseparable from Theodor Eicke, one of the central figures in shaping Dachau and the camp model that followed. Eicke did not create a normal military culture and then add ideology on top. He brought the culture of ideological discipline, dehumanization, and relentless obedience with him. That mattered from the start because it meant Totenkopf's reputation was never built on battlefield performance alone. It was built on what kind of men the Nazi system wanted these soldiers to become. And that is the first fracture in the legend. Later, admirers tried to treat Totenkopf as a purely military formation that happened to fight hard. But the division was never just military. Its origin mattered, its symbolism mattered, its institutional ancestry mattered, and on the Eastern Front, those things were remembered. If you subscribe now, the next collapse of an SS legend will make even more sense after this one. That is why the breakout from Budapest matters so much. It was not simply the last stand of a battered formation. It was the moment when the division's myth of elite toughness collided with the full price of what that myth had been built on. Because by February 1945, the Red Army was not confronting a fresh unit. It was confronting a name loaded with years of fear, propaganda, testimony, revenge, and consequence. And once that happened, Budapest was no longer just a siege. It was an accounting. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning of the war, before Budapest, before Kursk, before the Red Army began pushing west with unstoppable force. The key figure is Theodor Eicke. Eicke was not just another SS officer looking for military prestige. Before the division's frontline fame, he had already played a major role in shaping the concentration camp system, especially at Dachau. Under him, discipline was not merely strict, it was ideological. Ruthlessness was not a side effect. It was part of the design. Men were trained to obey, harden themselves, and treat designated enemies as beings outside normal human restraint. When that culture moved into a combat formation, the result was Totenkopf. That does not mean every later soldier in the division had served in the camps. They had not. The unit changed over time, took losses, absorbed replacements, and evolved into a frontline armored formation. But the name, the symbolism, and the institutional memory never disappeared. The division's identity remained tied to a harsher SS world than ordinary military units could claim. That difference began to show early. In 1940, during the campaign in France, elements of Totenkopf became associated with the Le Paradis massacre, in which surrendered British troops were killed after capture. This is one of the most important early warning signs in the story, Because it exposed something later, mythmakers tried to smooth over. The line between combat and atrocity was dangerously thin in this formation. The problem was not just battlefield aggression. The problem was a culture shaped to see enemies as people unworthy of normal treatment. And then, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa opened the largest land invasion in history. But on the Eastern Front, ordinary military language quickly stopped being enough. This was not simply an invasion for territory. Hitler's regime framed it as an ideological and racial war, and SS formations moved into a theater where military conquest, occupation terror, anti-partisan warfare, political repression, and mass killing often overlapped. That overlap is where Totenkopf's name became poisonous. It is important to stay precise here. Not every crime in the East was committed by Totenkopf. The machinery of violence involved many parts of the Nazi system: the Wehrmacht, SS units, police formations, auxiliaries, Einsatzgruppen, and occupation authorities. History gets weaker when everything is collapsed into one blurred accusation. But memory does not work that cleanly. For many Soviet soldiers and civilians, the SS became a single black category: camp men, execution units, ideological fanatics, village burners, anti-partisan sweepers, and political enforcers. And Totenkopf, more than most names, fit that image instantly. Even where the exact perpetrator of a crime might vary, the skull insignia fed a single conclusion. These were not opponents in a normal war. These were the men of the regime that had come east to destroy entire populations and reorder the land through terror. That mattered more with every passing year. In military terms, Totenkopf also built a reputation the Germans admired. It fought hard. It endured huge losses. At Demyansk in 1942, the division helped cement its image as a formation that could hold in brutal conditions. That reputation later fed the Waffen SS legend: fanatical, resilient, dependable under pressure. But there was always a hidden cost. Once Berlin believed Totenkopf would keep fighting under almost any conditions, it became easier to throw the division into increasingly punishing situations. Hardness became a resource to be exploited. The more the division proved it could endure, the more it was sent into battles where endurance itself became a form of slow destruction. That is the second fracture in the myth. The same qualities that made the unit useful also made it expendable. And by the middle of the war, the Soviet side was changing too. The Red Army of 1941 had been shocked, shattered, and driven backward. The Red Army of 1943 was different. It had learned, adapted, rebuilt command structures, improved operational planning, and gathered not only resources, but rage. Soviet soldiers had seen burned towns, dead civilians, destroyed villages, occupation policy, mass executions, and the immense human cost of German rule. Whether every individual soldier knew the legal distinctions between Waffen SS, camp guards, police battalions, and mobile killing units is almost beside the point. What many of them knew was simpler. The skull meant SS. SS meant no mercy had been shown to Soviet lands. And that memory was beginning to reshape the war. So by the time Totenkopf reached the next great test, it was carrying two reputations at once. One inside Germany: elite, relentless, politically reliable. One in the East: feared, hated, and tied to a wider system of brutality that many Soviet soldiers believed had forfeited any claim to ordinary treatment. That contradiction would become fatal. The turning point was not only military, it was psychological. By 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had become a contest not just of courage, but of production, intelligence, logistics, fuel, reserves, command skill, and time. Germany could still strike hard, but it could no longer assume that battlefield skill or ideological fanaticism would solve deeper strategic problems. That is where Kursk enters the story. During Operation Citadel in July 1943, Totenkopf took part in the southern attack that aimed to pinch off the Kursk salient. In tactical terms, the division still had teeth. It was an armored formation with experience, aggression, and a hard-won reputation. But Kursk exposed a brutal truth. Even strong German formations could no longer break Soviet defenses quickly enough to change the strategic balance. The Red Army had prepared deeply layered defenses, artillery concentrations, anti-tank belts, reserves, and a system designed to absorb and blunt exactly the kind of assault the Germans were launching. This matters because after Kursk, the myth changed. Before Kursk, a division like Totenkopf could still be imagined as a spearhead, capable of restoring momentum. After Kursk, it looked more like a weapon Germany kept using after the war's logic had already turned against it. And that is when the division's two reputations started feeding each other in the worst possible way. From Berlin's perspective, Totenkopf was still valuable because it would fight hard where pressure was highest. From the Soviet perspective, Totenkopf remained a priority enemy because of what it represented. So the division was squeezed from both sides, used harder by its own regime, hated more deeply by the enemy, and dragged forward into a war that was becoming less survivable by the month. As the Red Army advanced west in 1944, the geography changed, but the emotional climate did not soften. If anything, it sharpened. The Soviets were no longer fighting only on devastated home soil. They were carrying the war back toward the states and cities tied to Hitler's empire. Along the way, they encountered the wreckage left behind by occupation and retreat. In that atmosphere, Waffen SS formations attracted particular hostility. The distinction between frontline soldier and member of a criminal political military system was thinner for SS units than for many Wehrmacht formations, and Totenkopf's very name made that problem impossible to hide. Then came Hungary. By late 1944 and early 1945, Hungary had become one of Hitler's final obsessions. The region mattered for prestige, for remaining oil supplies, and for the fantasy that the Reich could still stabilize the Eastern Front through a combination of stubborn defense and counterattack. It was fantasy because Germany no longer had the margin for these operations. But Hitler kept forcing them anyway. Budapest became the ultimate example. When Soviet forces encircled the city in late December 1944, tens of thousands of Axis troops were trapped inside. What followed was a siege of destruction, attrition, and collapse. Buildings were reduced floor by floor. Civilians were trapped in basements, cellars, shattered districts, and contested streets. The defenders were slowly starved of ammunition, medicine, and hope. Inside that city were men of Totenkopf. And now the entire story snaps into focus. Because Budapest was not merely another place where the division suffered losses. It was the place where all the older meanings attached to the skull came due at once. The men inside the city were facing the Red Army at the very stage of the war, when Soviet forces were strongest, least inclined to leniency, and carrying years of remembered destruction behind them. For many soldiers and ordinary units, surrender was terrifying, but still imaginable. For SS men, especially in a formation called Totenkopf, it could feel like a gamble with much darker odds. That fear shaped the breakout attempt. On the night of February 11th, 1945, with Budapest clearly doomed, the defenders launched a desperate attempt to escape westward. In theory, it was a military operation. In practice, it was the violent collapse of order. Men ran through ruined districts, vineyards, slopes, gardens, rail lines, and killing zones swept by Soviet fire. Heavy equipment was abandoned, communications shattered, units dissolved into fragments. And somewhere inside that darkness sat the most revealing fact of all. Many of the men wearing the skull no longer wanted to be recognized by it. Not because they had suddenly discovered morality, because they understood consequence. A symbol once worn as proof of status could now mark a man for harsher treatment the moment he was identified. That is not a side detail. That is the whole story. Compressed into one image, the skull no longer promised power. It invited recognition. And recognition had become dangerous. There is a tempting version of this story that sounds dramatic but is actually too simple. It goes like this. The Soviets hated Totenkopf because of SS crimes, so they singled the division out and annihilated it. There is truth inside that, but only part of the truth. The stronger version is more brutal. Totenkopf was destroyed not only by Soviet hatred, it was also destroyed by the logic of the regime that created it. That distinction matters because it changes the meaning of the ending. Hitler and the SS leadership had long wanted formations that were ideologically unwavering, politically dependable, and prepared to hold impossible ground. On the surface, Totenkopf fit that demand perfectly. It fought hard, endured losses, and could be counted on in the ugly situations. But those strengths came with a poison built in. A formation taught that relentlessness was virtue is easier to sacrifice. A command culture that glorifies hard men is more likely to spend them. A regime that confuses fanaticism with military sustainability eventually burns through its own best formations. That is exactly what happened. Demyansk fed the legend. Kursk exposed its limits. Hungary turned the legend into a death sentence. By early 1945, Germany could not afford symbolic operations. It needed realism, conservation, withdrawals timed to preserve strength, and strategic clarity. Instead, Hitler kept demanding hold orders, relief attempts, and prestige battles in sectors where the Soviet advantage was already overwhelming. The effort to hold and relieve Budapest consumed armored strength Germany no longer had, and divisions like Totenkopf, because of their reputation, were among the formations most likely to be thrown into these impossible missions. So, the division was killed in two ways at the same time. First, by the enemy. Second, by the fantasy that ideological hardness could replace fuel, manpower, ammunition, and strategic sanity. This is where the myth really breaks, because post-war romanticizers often tried to turn units like Totenkopf into pure soldiers trapped in a political war around them. But the opposite is closer to the truth. Totenkopf was one of the clearest examples of a formation whose military identity was political from birth. It was never detached from the SS world. It was never cleanly separate from the structures that made that world feared. And because of that, its soldiers entered the final phase of the war under a burden ordinary military myths cannot carry away. There is also another uncomfortable truth here. Not every later replacement in the division had personally participated in the division's earlier crimes or in the camp system. Historical precision matters. But war does not distribute consequence only on an individual moral basis. Formations accumulate reputations. Symbols accumulate meaning. Institutions create legacies their later members inherit, whether they deserve all of them or not. Totenkopf's men in Budapest were therefore fighting under several weights at once: the Soviet army in front of them, Hitler's delusions behind them, and the division's own history on their collars. That is why the Budapest breakout feels like more than an operational failure. It feels like a moral and historical trap closing at the same time. Not because every Soviet soldier was calmly applying a legal judgment, not because every Totenkopf man was guilty in the same way, but because the war had become so saturated with ideology, atrocity, and revenge that symbols now had operational consequences. A badge could alter how a man was seen. How he was seen could alter whether he was spared. And whether he was spared could alter whether the war ended for him in captivity or in a ditch. That is the hidden factor the flatter versions miss. Totenkopf did not simply lose battles. It reached a stage of the war where its own identity had become strategically dangerous. After Budapest fell on February 13, 1945, what remained of Totenkopf did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. Elements continued fighting during the last months of the war, as the German front disintegrated across Hungary and into Austria. But the division was finished in the only sense that mattered. It could still resist, it could still retreat, it could still kill and die. It could no longer change the outcome. And by then, the legend that had once surrounded the division had become almost unrecognizable. This is the final payoff of the story. At the beginning of the war, the skull projected menace. By the end, it projected exposure. At the beginning, ideological fanaticism had been sold as strength. By the end, it had made the division easier for Hitler to waste and easier for the enemy to hate. At the beginning, Totenkopf could be presented inside the Nazi world as proof that a harder political soldier would outperform the ordinary one. By the end, the division stood as proof that brutality, when fused to delusion and overused by a collapsing regime, does not create durability. It creates a longer, uglier destruction. That is why Budapest is the right ending point. Not because it was the division's absolute last day in existence, but because it concentrates the entire story into one decisive sequence, a once feared formation, trapped in a ruined capital, trying to escape an enemy that had spent years learning what its symbol meant. And there is no clean heroic ending available there, no serious redemption arc, no version where battlefield competence wipes away institutional ancestry, no convincing claim that the skull meant only soldierly toughness by 1945. The division's origin in the Death's Head system mattered too much. The wider SS record in occupied Europe and the Soviet Union mattered too much. The political nature of the formation mattered too much. And the final months of the war, especially on the Eastern Front, were too brutal for those facts to disappear behind post-war mythology. So, what destroyed Hitler's most fanatical soldiers? Not one Soviet general, not one encirclement, not one revenge order. What destroyed them was consequence. The consequence of building a combat formation out of the culture of the camp system. The consequence of turning ideology into military identity. The consequence of allowing the skull to become famous for the wrong reasons. The consequence of serving a regime that used fanatical units as expendable tools long after the strategic war was already lost. And finally, the consequence of facing an enemy that had suffered too much to read that symbol neutrally. By the spring of 1945, many surviving SS men tried to hide who they were. Some destroyed papers, some removed insignia, some hoped to reach Western rather than Soviet captivity. That instinct alone says everything. It shows that even the men inside the system understood that the image once meant to inspire fear had become a danger to its wearer. That is the last reversal. The badge had not stopped being powerful. Its power had simply changed direction. In the end, the Soviets did not merely defeat Totenkopf in the ordinary military sense. They helped strip away the illusion that a formation like this could ever be judged only by its battlefield endurance. The division had fought hard, that is true. It had also carried into war one of the darkest institutional inheritances in the entire German system. That is also true. And when those two truths met the final Soviet advance, the result was not glory, it was entrapment. So when the men of Totenkopf ran through the dark outside Budapest in February 1945, they were not just fleeing artillery, infantry, and encirclement. They were fleeing the full weight of what their own name had come to mean. And that was the one enemy they could never outrun.